Welcome back to Hardware Unboxed. Today we're reviewing the absolutely enormous Samsung Odyssey G9, a curved super ultra-wide monitor that promises to offer the most immersive gaming experience on the market. A couple of months ago we checked out the Odyssey G7, Samsung's 16:9 version of this display, and we were pretty impressed with the performance, so hopefully the Odyssey G9 can live up to the same standard. Let's talk about some basic specs. This is a 49-inch 5120 by 1440 VA monitor, so a 32:9 aspect ratio equivalent to two 27-inch 2560 by 1440 displays stitched together side by side. The display is seriously huge, measuring in at over 1 meter wide, so you'll need to make sure you have plenty of desk space available for this beast. In addition, Samsung are using the same 1000R curvature as the Odyssey G7, which at this sort of display width is pretty noticeable. I wasn't a big fan of the 1000R curve on the G7. I felt it looked quite odd on a 16:9 monitor and introduced quite a bit of distortion for basic PC tasks like web browsing or video playback. While you still get distortion on the G9, mostly to the same degree, that's offset by the sheer immersiveness of this display for gaming. The edges of the panel wrap neatly into your field of view when sitting at a standard desk viewing distance, and unlike with the G7, you hardly notice the curve when exploring game worlds or shooting up enemies. I actually feel this display would be worse with a less aggressive curve and not very good at all with a flat panel. However, like I said, there is still some distortion in non-gaming settings, which doesn't make the Odyssey G9 a very versatile monitor. I've talked in the past about how displays like the LG 27GN950 are great as dual-use monitors for gaming and content creation as an example. That's not really the case with the G9. This is a pure gaming monitor. Fitting with its focus as a gaming display, the G9 packs impressive gaming specifications. The refresh rate goes up to a monstrous 240Hz, the highest we've seen for this resolution. This display has nearly 90% of the pixel count of a 4K monitor, but a far higher refresh rate than any 4K display on the market today, so it will really push your GPU to its limits and provide a lot of future-proofing for upgrades down the line. It's also G-Sync compatible and packs AMD FreeSync Premium Pro support with Display HDR 1000 certification as well. The G9 may be two 1440p monitors side by side, but it doesn't cost the same as two 1440p monitors. It is more expensive. A single 27-inch Odyssey G7 will set you back $700 US, while the Odyssey G9 has a regular retail price of $1,700 US, about a 20% premium to get this resolution in a single display. I have seen the G9 available for below this price on occasion, but it's still a premium tier display for high-end buyers. The design, all things considered, is quite good, and I'm impressed with what Samsung has been able to achieve with such a huge display panel. The stand is height and tilt adjustable, which I expected, but it can also swivel and remain sturdy while doing so. For a big, heavy beast that's over a meter wide, having this range of motion in the stand is impressive. You'll need to find quite a bit of desk space to fit the wide stand legs, although beyond that it's quite reasonable. The construction has a premium look and feel to it, with Samsung opting for a sci-fi-like white glossy rear with a glowing RGB LED ring around the stand connection. It looks pretty good from either side, although naturally from the front the massive display will dominate what you're looking at. In terms of ports, the key inclusions here are two DisplayPort 1.4 and one HDMI 2.0 input. You'll need a GPU capable of display stream compression over DisplayPort to hit the full 5120 by 1440 resolution at 240Hz, while the HDMI port is limited to just 60Hz. As for the on-screen display, we get directional toggle control and a pretty smooth interface that's easy to navigate. Samsung's array of features is okay, but not super comprehensive, with gamer things like crosshairs and black boosting modes, plus a range of color controls. You also get picture-in-picture, which is quite handy for such a large display that is well suited to two side-by-side 1440p inputs. Unfortunately, there is no backlight strobing feature, one of the few things that was available on the G7 but isn't found here. Before getting into the performance section of this review, I think it's worth touching on some of the quality assurance issues and flickering reports that we've read about the Odyssey G9. It did seem that early buyers of this display received units with poor quality control and numerous issues with build quality and image quality, causing Samsung to recall the monitor and perform additional QA checks. While the recall was never official and remains an unconfirmed rumor of sorts, it did seem there were delays on the second round of stock, and my unit does have a nice QA checked sticker on the box. As far as I can tell from buyers receiving units in the last few months, as well as my own unit that I received, most of these QA issues have been resolved. The build and image quality on my unit is very good actually, certainly nothing like some of the initial reports, and with the latest firmware version 1008.1, which all owners should download and apply, I did not experience any flickering issues while gaming in the SDR mode. However, there are two lingering issues with the G9 that early adopters should be aware of. The first one is that I did see flickering while testing the monitor's HDR mode at 240Hz, although this issue wasn't present at 120Hz. The second is that the G9 doesn't work with Nvidia's GeForce RTX 30 series GPUs at 240Hz with the latest drivers. This is an Nvidia driver issue, as the display does work on 20 series cards that support DSC, and it also works fine on supported AMD GPUs at the maximum refresh rate. If you do have a 30 series GPU, this is something to be aware of, and while I expect it will eventually get fixed, it's not a great situation right now, especially for a monitor that Nvidia has certified as G-Sync compatible. Time for a look at response times, and with the Odyssey G7, if you are using the display with adaptive sync variable refresh rate enabled, and I suspect that will be most people given this monitor works with all modern GPUs, then you will be unable to change the overdrive setting, so the focus of this testing will look at this single mode. What is immediately clear when viewing response time performance at 240Hz is that the Odyssey G9 and Odyssey G7 do not deliver the same experience. The G9 in our testing is a faster monitor at this refresh rate with an impressive 1.94 millisecond grey-to-grey average. However, this comes at the cost of a higher level of overshoot. There are many more transitions here where inverse ghosting is noticeable, although luckily these inverse ghost trails decay quickly, so they aren't massively obvious, but I suspect most people will still see them. Ideally here, instead of pushing up to a 2 millisecond average response time, the G9 would dial back the overdrive a bit to reduce overshoot. Like with the G7 though, there is no dark level smearing here, as Samsung has effectively solved this issue with their latest generation of VA panels. Overshoot is highest in the dark regions, but the sluggish responses in the 0 to 40% grey range are no more, so you won't see long dark trails behind moving objects. Generally, this is a very clear experience. Now, a lot of people viewing this image will probably be disappointed at the performance on offer here given the high level of overshoot. But there's good news, because it's really only at 240Hz that overshoot is problematic. When we shift down to 200Hz, most of the panel's overshoot issues disappear, only leaving a few issues with dark transitions. We are left with a 2.57 millisecond average response time, which is very fast for a modern monitor. In fact, I can actually tell you that this performance holds true up to 220Hz or so, making only the top 20Hz poor in terms of overshoot. Given that gaming at such a high resolution and above 220Hz will be difficult for at least the next few years, having the top 20Hz perform worse isn't ideal, but it's not as bad as it could have been. At lower refresh rates from 165Hz right through to 60Hz, performance remains roughly the same, with small changes to response times that deliver between a 2.0 and 3.3 millisecond experience for the most part. Most refresh rates still have a few overshoot issues in the dark region, but overall performance is very strong and lightning quick, delivering great clarity, particularly at higher refresh rates. It also means we get a single overdrive mode experience for variable refresh gaming, a requirement for high-end displays, and not having access to overdrive settings isn't too problematic. When comparing the G9 to other monitors on the market, this new Samsung Super Ultra Wide stacks up favourably when it comes to response times at the maximum refresh rate. However, due to high overshoot, the G9 sacrifices accuracy to get there, so ultimately panels like the Asus PG259QN and Odyssey G7 deliver a better experience, although admittedly in different classes. It's in average performance across the variable refresh range that the G9 shines, topping the charts. As we talked about earlier, it's really only above 220Hz where the monitor suffers from high overshoot, as at all other refresh rates the amount of overshoot is more manageable. While the G9 still has a relatively high average inverse ghosting rate compared to other displays, it has a class-leading 2.7 millisecond grey-to-grey average, making it the fastest display that we've tested and slightly faster than the Odyssey G7. It also easily beats other ultra-wide monitors in our charts, including entrants like the LG 34G and 850, although this is a much more expensive display. At such high prices though, you'd expect great performance, so it's good to see Samsung deliver that. Dark level smearing is a non-issue with the Odyssey G9, like with the Odyssey G7. This is really the first series of VA panels where dark performance is acceptable in comparison with TN and IPS alternatives, and that's a really great thing for the future of this panel tech. Average error rates are very high at 240Hz, just further highlighting what we talked about earlier. As for 60Hz performance, this display is very quick at that refresh rate, particularly when using a variable refresh rate. The display delivers noticeably worse performance at a fixed 60Hz as opposed to using 60Hz within the scope of a variable refresh with a 240Hz maximum refresh, so this display is really geared towards variable refresh rate gaming. Input lag is very good, with essentially no processing delay on the monitor's side, and when backed with extremely fast response times and a high refresh rate, total lag in the chain is below 5 milliseconds, one of the best results we've seen. With that said, I should point out that the input lag is much higher if you plan on running the monitor in its 60Hz mode, although I don't think too many people buying the monitor will do that. Naturally, power consumption is high, although no worse than the Acer Predator X35, which uses a smaller panel with an FALD backlight. The good news is that power consumption is less than twice as high as the Odyssey G7, despite having twice the screen real estate, so from that perspective, it's more efficient to have one G9 than two G7s by a fair margin. For color performance, the Odyssey G9 covers 89% of the DCI-P3 color gamut, so that's in line with the Odyssey G7 and other VA monitors we've seen in recent years. The gamut coverage here is not as impressive as most modern IPS monitors, so it's not really sufficient for wide gamut color work, but it does deliver a larger than sRGB color gamut for increased saturation and better colors in the HDR mode. Out-of-the-box color accuracy is average, not as good as the Odyssey G7 in terms of its adherence to the sRGB gamma curve. With total gamma in the 2.4 range, this makes the monitor too dark on average, and that leads to mediocre Delta E results. This also affects saturation and color checker results, with Delta E 2000 averages in the 3.0 to 4.0 range being around the average for a gaming monitor, certainly not better than average like we'd expect from a high-end display. This performance cannot be improved upon significantly with OSD setting adjustments. There is an sRGB mode that clamps the gamut somewhat well to sRGB, but it has issues with saturation otherwise, and that leads to high Delta E performance that isn't significantly improved upon the default configuration. So the best course of action here is a full calibration. We get typically solid results from a display cal calibration, aside from a few inconsistencies here and there. As I've said a few times in this review, the Odyssey G9 isn't an ideal monitor for color accurate work due to its curve and insufficient P3 coverage, but you can still eke out some respectable results for sRGB and P3 with the color profile. Brightness in the SDR mode is strong, with over 400 nits peak, while minimum brightness is also good around the 60 nit range. The contrast ratio, on the other hand, is unimpressive for a VA panel. While at 2000:1 it is higher than IPS and TN monitors, it's behind the best VA panels that we've tested. So you can expect somewhat deeper blacks than an IPS, but it's not going to give you that best experience that we've seen in that area. Uniformity was surprisingly good for a wide display, producing better results than my Odyssey G7, especially for dark grey uniformity, where my G7 had noticeable backlight bleed along the outer edges. That wasn't an issue with my G9 unit, and generally I was impressed with how even the image is, even though the Delta E results aren't perfect. This is a really wide display, so getting uniformity perfect is a challenge, and I think Samsung have done well here. To wrap up our testing, let's take a quick look at HDR performance. Like the G7, the Odyssey G9 is a semi-HDR panel in that it does have some areas that are superior to regular SDR displays, like a wider color gamut and high peak brightness, but it lacks a strong contrast ratio. This is because the G9 only features 10 edge-lit local dimming zones, which is insufficient for such a large display. While you may be able to occasionally get better than SDR experience due to high flash brightness or better colors, the amount of haloing around bright objects due to low zone count dimming is terrible and impacts the experience in a bad way. Full screen sustained brightness is around the 650 nit mark, which is respectable and definitely sufficient for most content. Flash brightness is also very strong at over 1100 nits, matching some of the better FALD HDR monitors that I've reviewed. We also see around that 1100 nit mark at low window sizes below about 25%, so small bright elements are brightly lit on this monitor, with a fall off to 650 nits at larger window sizes. For contrast, there's good and bad news here. The good news is the local dimming array will fully switch off the backlight to show black, which results in a very high flash versus black contrast that exceeds the capabilities of our testing tools. The G9 also has an advantage in our best case single frame contrast test due to the size of the panel. If you have a bright element on the left side of the display, it can be shown at up to 1100 nits, while a dark area on the right side could have the FALD backlight fully switched off, delivering 0 nits. There's no bleed between these zones as the panel is so massive, so again it's possible to have a huge contrast ratio on the screen at the same time. However, more realistically, we will be seeing these worst case numbers, where the Odyssey G9 only delivers its native contrast ratio. That's because the local dimming zone count is very low, so you'll see massive halos extending from any bright areas to the edges of the panel. This is very noticeable and looks terrible. In dynamic scenes with lots of different areas of bright and dark shades, you may at times get slightly better than SDR contrast, but if the scene is busy, then you'll get these worst case numbers, which are unimpressive. Overall, the Samsung Odyssey G9 is a pretty good high-end super ultra-wide gaming monitor that fills a niche that you simply cannot get with any other monitor on the market right now. It has a unique combination of a 1440p double wide resolution, super high and future-proof 240Hz refresh rate, and decent VA colors that will be very attractive to those looking at putting together an elite gaming setup. Like with the smaller Odyssey G7, the strengths of the G9 lie entirely with response time performance. While there are a few stumbles at 240Hz specifically, at refresh rates from 220Hz and below, the G9 delivers outstanding performance among the fastest monitors we've tested. This helps deliver a gaming experience with excellent motion clarity and a smooth high frame rate without any of the typical VA downsides like dark level smearing. Seeing a VA panel feature so high in our charts is impressive, and doubly so when it's such a high resolution. The G9 does a few things better than the G7 as well. In particular, I feel the 1000R curve is much more appropriate for such a massive display and really adds to the immersion while gaming. My unit also had better uniformity, and in its HDR mode it can get a fair bit brighter if you're interested in gaming in that mode. So a few of the downsides that accompany the G7 are a bit of a non-issue here, and that's a good thing for a premium display. Samsung also succeeds with delivering good color performance, although it's not class leading in any area. You're getting good viewing angles, a wide color gamut, and better than IPS contrast ratio, which makes the G9 better for gaming in dark environments, but color calibration is only average, P3 gamut coverage is below that of the best IPS displays today despite using quantum dot technology, and the contrast ratio could be better for a VA. That's not to say the G9 delivers a poor color experience, because this monitor is actually very good for visuals. It just isn't quite there as a dual use monitor, and the curve doesn't help in this regard. If you're buying an Odyssey G9, it should be for high refresh rate gaming with a super ultra wide screen and really nothing else. There are a few other teething issues with this sort of monitor. In some ways it does feel like the first wave of buyers have been early adopters. While Samsung has reportedly resolved their questionable quality control and flickering issues, there are still some problems with the HDR mode and with RTX 30 series GPU compatibility. It could be worth waiting just to make sure those problems are resolved before jumping in. I also feel that for a $1,700 product, the HDR performance is very underwhelming, and in this price class we really should be getting at least a somewhat better HDR experience. This display is more expensive than a 48-inch LG CX OLED, for example, yet delivers far inferior HDR. And that's disappointing given the refresh rate and resolution are perfect for future-proofing over the next 5 years. One of the biggest features in gaming that will only grow in popularity over the next decade is HDR, and with the Odyssey G9 you really are only getting a slightly better experience than SDR. While I don't necessarily think we need to be getting 512 zone backlights like the even more expensive Acer Predator X35, 10 zones is simply inadequate in a flagship product. But if you're willing to overlook HDR performance and if a couple of the early adopter issues are ironed out, then the Samsung Odyssey G9 is definitely worth considering as a high-end monitor. It is pricey, with a premium tacked on for adding two 1440p displays into the one panel, but gaming on this beast has been one of the most immersive experiences I've had yet with a monitor. That's it for this one. If you're interested in supporting our monitor testing, you can support us directly on places like Patreon or Floatplane. You'll get access to our ICC profiles, monthly live streams, Discord chat if you want to ask me monitor questions, all that sort of thing. So yeah, links to that are in the description below. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one.